Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a story that completely transcends football. We're looking at one of the most profound events in sports and sociological history, a tale of absolute triumph, unspeakable tragedy, and quite literally, the rebirth of a nation. Let's get right into it.
So, you've got to ask yourself, how exactly did the loss of 31 people on a foggy hillside end up redefining the very soul of a broken nation? As we go through this deep dive, you'll see pretty clearly that this wasn't just a plane crash. It was actually a defining moment that entirely reshaped the identity of Italy right after World War II. Which brings us to Section 1, the day the sky fell. We're starting off on May 4th, 1949. It was an afternoon where the sky above Turin had dropped so incredibly low, it almost felt like it was physically pressing right against the earth. The team was flying back from Lisbon after playing a testimonial match for Benfica's captain Francisco Ferreira. They took off at 9:52 in the morning, grabbed some fuel in Barcelona, and were approaching Turin by late afternoon. But the weather was just atrocious. We're talking heavy rain, insanely thick fog, visibility was down to maybe 40 meters, and then at 17:05, disaster struck. Their Fiat G212 aircraft slammed into the rear embankment of the Basilica of Superga, which is this huge structure sitting high on a hill overlooking the city. Instantly, 31 lives were lost. There were absolutely zero survivors. That number included 18 players, plus their coaches, journalists, club officials, and the flight crew. Literally, in a single, devastating moment, an entire dynasty was wiped off the map. Moving on to Section 2, Architects of Tomorrow's Football. Because look, before they were a tragedy, Il Grande Torino were a total revolution. They were completely redefining how football could even be played. If you compare them to the traditional, super rigid Italian style of that era, what they were doing was mind-blowing. Their Hungarian coach, Erno Agri-Erbstein, who by the way was a Holocaust survivor, totally transformed their tactics. He brought in Il Sistema, which was this highly fluid adaptation of the English WM formation. And this wasn't just about moving pieces around on a chalkboard. It was about zipping the ball around quickly, building incredible synergy across positions, and playing a brand of attacking football that was genuinely decades ahead of its time. I mean, they weren't just winning. They were absolutely obliterating the record books. 5 consecutive league titles, the very first Italian domestic double. Get this, they scored a staggering 125 goals in a 40-match season, and they went unbeaten at home for 93 consecutive games. No way, right? They were so dominant that on one specific occasion, Torino provided 10 of the starting 11 players for the Italian national team. They were quite literally the entire face of Italian football. And right at the absolute center of this unstoppable machine was their captain, Valentino Mazzola. He was this incredibly modern, complete attacking midfielder, but doing it back in the 1940s. He actually had this famous, kind of legendary ritual. Whenever a match got really tough and Torino needed a spark, Mazzola would physically roll up his sleeves on the pitch. It was like this ultimate signal to his teammates saying, okay, time to go to work, and a terrifying warning to the opponents that the game was, for sure, effectively over. He was the emotional and tactical heartbeat of the whole squad. All right, Section 3, Heroes of a Broken Nation. So you might be wondering, why did a football team mean so much to a country that was just crawling out from the absolute ruins of war and dictatorship? Well, think about it. During the fascist era, the ultimate hero was the military martyr, basically someone who belonged to the state and died for the regime. But post-World War II Italy, they desperately needed something totally different. They needed a civil martyr. They needed heroes who belonged to the everyday community, completely stripped of toxic political ideology. The Grande Torino players perfectly fit the bill. They represented youth, excellence, and a fresh start. They became these safe, non-political symbols of a renewed national pride. In fact, academic research by Daniele Serapia actually maps out this exact cultural transition. His analysis argues that the Superga tragedy essentially became Italy's first massive collective mourning after World War II. It finally allowed a deeply traumatized nation to grieve openly and collectively, which was something that was just impossible in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the war itself. And the scale of this grief was just unprecedented. We're talking over 500,000 people pouring into the streets of Turin for the funerals. To put that into perspective, at a time of extreme social tension between the Christian Democrats and the left-wing Popular Front, this massive gathering somehow managed to bridge those intense political divides. Everyone, literally, regardless of where they leaned politically, was united in a singular, totally impartial grief for their share of heroes. Let's look at Section 4, A Nation's Collective Mourning. The way the media communicated this event to the public played a massive role in shaping all of this national catharsis. Newspapers and newsreels leaned super heavily on deeply ingrained cultural tropes, most notably the Mater Dolorosa, or the Weeping Mother. The press focused incredibly intensely on the unbearable grief of the mothers, wives, and widows left behind. By highlighting these weeping women, the media gave the Italian public a highly emotional, religious, and safe channel to express the pent-up trauma and fear of death they were still carrying around from the war years.
This exact sentiment is captured so perfectly by the famous writer Dino Buzzati. In a really heartbreaking piece, he directly urged families not to go into the morgue to look at the bodies. He pleaded, "No, women don't enter. We must remember their sincere faces, how they smiled happily when the goal rumbled." He desperately wanted the heroes to remain uncorrupted in the nation's memory, kind of frozen in time as vibrant, victorious athletes, rather than victims of a brutal crash. And the emotional weight of those funerals really culminated in a speech by Ottorino Barossi, who was the head of the Italian Football Association at the time. Addressing Valentino Mazzola's coffin directly, with literal tears in his eyes, he posthumously awarded Torino the 1948-49 championship. His words were just devastating. "Captain Valentino, this is the cup, the fifth cup. Smile. It is a great cup. Torino's cup." It completely echoed the profound sense of loss felt across the entire sporting world. Finally, let's explore Section 5, the enduring physical legacy. The crash at Superga ended an era in an instant, but the tangible legacy Il Grande Torino left behind is still telling their story today. You see, the psychological trauma of the crash was so deep and pervasive that it permanently altered Italy's trajectory in world football. The very next year, the Italian national team absolutely refused to get on a plane for the 1950 World Cup in Brazil. Instead, they traveled all the way there by ship. As you can imagine, the journey was physically and mentally exhausting. It took a huge toll on the players, and Italy ended up being eliminated early in the tournament. But amidst all that sorrow, there were also these incredibly beautiful acts of sporting respect. For the final 4 matches of that Serie A season, Torino obviously had to field their youth squad. Well, in response, their opponents, out of pure, unadulterated respect, also chose to field their youth players. And Torino's boys actually won those remaining games. On top of that, the Italian national team wore special black mourning stripes on their kits for an entire year. Today, the memory of the team is kept alive through physical artifacts. The former national team coach, Vittorio Pozzo, was given the unimaginably grim task of identifying the bodies at Superga. He was actually only able to recognize Romeo Menti by a pin of his former club, Fiorentina, which Menti always carried with him. That pin, along with Virgilio Marasosa's shirt from a Brazil tour and Aldo Ballerin's shin pads recovered from the crash, are all carefully preserved to this day. If you ever visit the Museo del Calcio, the Italian football museum, you can actually see these artifacts for yourself. That includes Carlo Parola's number 5 kit. What's really striking is that instead of a standard removable armband, there is a black mourning stripe permanently stitched directly into the sleeve. These meticulously preserved items are absolutely crucial for ensuring that the story of Il Grande Torino is passed down so that future generations never forget the true weight of what was lost. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How do we carry the memory of those who invent the future before they are lost to it? Even though the sky fell on that foggy hill in 1949, cutting a dynasty devastatingly short, Il Grande Torino had already given us a brilliant glimpse of tomorrow. Their tactical genius, their unifying spirit, and their enduring legacy prove that some teams don't just play the game, they completely change the world around them. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive gave you a totally new perspective on a genuinely legendary team.